Invite the maid too, Richard Whitmore said with a careless laugh. Let us see if she even knows how to walk into a real party. The room erupted in low, amused chuckles, glasses of aged whiskey and sparkling champagne catching the golden chandelier light as several of the city's most powerful guests leaned back into velvet chairs. No one questioned the joke. In Richard Whitmore world, jokes usually came at someone else's expense. The Whitmore estate stretched across nearly 5 acres outside Greenwich, Connecticut, a mansion of white stone columns and long windows that glowed like a palace every evening. Alicia Carter knew those floors well. She had polished them for nearly 2 years, moving silently through hallways where the scent of lemon polish mixed with old money and quiet arrogance. On most nights, she kept her head down, her dark curls pulled neatly back, her uniform pressed, her footsteps careful across imported Italian marble. Tonight was no different. Alicia was wiping the long dining table in the West Wing when she heard the laughter drift from the grand sitting room. She did not intend to listen, but the house carried sound the way old churches carry whispers. Invite the maid, Richard repeated, his voice smooth and amused. His friends laughed harder this time. Someone asked if she even owned a dress. Another voice joked that perhaps they could place bets on whether she would recognize which fork to use. Alicia's hands paused on the cloth for only a moment. The polished wood reflected the soft glow of the chandelier above her, and in that reflection she could see her own calm eyes looking back. She finished wiping the table without hurry. The laughter down the hall eventually faded into the usual murmur of expensive conversation. A few minutes later the butler entered the room carrying a silver tray. On it rested a cream-colored envelope sealed with the Whitmore family crest. Mr. Whitmore asked that this be delivered to you, the butler said politely. Alicia accepted the envelope without surprise. The paper felt heavy between her fingers, the kind of thick cardstock that people used for invitations that cost more than most families spent on groceries in a week. She turned it over slowly and read the elegant lettering of her name. Alicia Carter. Her expression did not change, but something quiet and thoughtful passed through her eyes. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you cannot miss. Alicia opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a formal invitation to the Whitmore Charity Winter Gala, the most exclusive social event in Fairfield County. Governors, investors, media executives, and celebrities would attend. At the bottom of the card was a short handwritten note in Richard Whitmore confident script. Do try to come. It should be entertaining. Alicia closed the envelope and stood still for a moment in the quiet dining room. Outside the tall windows, the Connecticut night stretched across the gardens, where stone fountains whispered softly under pale moonlight. She placed the invitation back on the tray and continued her work, folding the cleaning cloth with slow precision. Anyone watching would have thought nothing had changed. But deep in the mansion hallway, another burst of laughter echoed from the sitting room as Richard Whitmore raised his glass again. None of them noticed the small shift in the air that had already begun the moment the invitation reached Alicia Carter's hands. And none of them yet understood that the joke they had just made would soon become the most unforgettable night of their lives. The next morning the Whitmore estate woke earlier than usual. Delivery trucks rolled through the tall iron gates just after sunrise, their tires crunching softly across the long gravel drive that curved through manicured lawns and sculpted hedges. Workers carried towering arrangements of white orchids through the front doors while electricians adjusted warm string lights along the balcony that overlooked the gardens. The Whitmore Charity Winter Gala was only 3 days away, and inside the mansion every room hummed with preparation. Alicia Carter moved through the quiet hallway with a linen basket balanced against her hip. She had already been awake since 5 in the morning, the way she always was. Years of working early shifts had trained her body to rise before the sun touched the tops of the maple trees outside the estate. The scent of fresh coffee drifted faintly from the kitchen downstairs, mixing with the clean smell of polished wood and citrus cleaner that lingered in the air. Alicia stepped into the West Wing guest corridor and began changing the sheets in one of the guest suites. The work was familiar and steady. Fold the blanket. Smooth the mattress. Tuck the corners tight. Her movements were calm and practiced, almost graceful in their rhythm. On the dresser beside the window sat the cream-colored envelope from the night before. Alicia had brought it upstairs after finishing her shift, placing it carefully beside the lamp before she went home. She had not thrown it away. She had not answered it either. As she lifted the pillow and smoothed the cotton case across the mattress, a voice drifted from the open hallway behind her. "You actually gave it to her," a young woman said with a laugh that carried the bright confidence of someone who had never doubted her place in the world. Alicia recognized the voice immediately. Emily Whitmore, Richard Whitmore's daughter. 23 years old, recently graduated from an elite university, and widely known in social magazines for her charity appearances and carefully curated life online. Alicia kept working as Emily and her friends stepped into the doorway. "Of course I gave it to her," Emily continued, lowering her voice but not enough to hide the amusement in it. "Father thought it would be funny." Can you imagine the look on her face when she walks into a ballroom full of billionaires? Emily's friend burst into laughter. "Do you really think she will come?" Emily shrugged lightly. "I almost hope she does. The videos would be priceless." Alicia's hands paused for the briefest moment against the white cotton sheet, but she did not turn around. Instead, she finished tucking the corner of the bed and lifted the folded blanket back into place. Emily finally noticed her standing there. "Oh, Alicia," Emily said brightly, as though nothing unusual had been discussed. "I did not realize you were working up here already." "Good morning, Miss Whitmore," Alicia replied calmly. Emily's eyes flicked to the envelope on the dresser. "You received the invitation?" Then Alicia nodded once. "Yes, Miss Whitmore." Emily smiled in a way that was polite on the surface but carried a sharp edge beneath it. "The gala is quite an event. The governor might even attend this year." She paused, tilting her head slightly. "If you decide to come, you should let us know." Alicia met her gaze briefly, her expression composed and unreadable. "Thank you for the invitation," she said softly. Emily gave a small shrug and turned toward the hallway again. "Well, do not feel pressured. I know those kinds of events can be intimidating." Her friend laughed quietly as they walked away down the corridor, their voices fading into the distance. Alicia stood still in the silent guest room for several seconds after they left. Outside the window, the morning sun had finally climbed above the trees, sending pale golden light across the lawns and fountains of the Whitmore estate. She walked slowly to the dresser and picked up the envelope again. The heavy cardstock felt cool in her hands. Alicia opened it once more and read the elegant lettering carefully. The Whitmore Charity Winter Gala. Formal attire required. Saturday evening at 7 o'clock. For a long moment, she simply looked at the words. Then a faint, thoughtful smile touched the corner of her lips, the kind of quiet smile that appears when someone finally reaches a decision they have been considering far longer than anyone realizes. Downstairs, the workers continued decorating the ballroom, unaware that the small choice Alicia Carter had just made in that quiet guest room would soon echo through the entire Whitmore estate. That evening, the Whitmore estate slowly returned to its usual quiet rhythm after the workers left. The temporary noise of delivery trucks and decorators faded, leaving behind the soft echo of footsteps along the marble floors and the distant hum of the fountain outside the main entrance. Alicia Carter finished her shift just after sunset. She placed the folded cleaning cloth back into the storage cabinet in the service hallway and tied her coat around her shoulders before stepping outside through the staff entrance. The autumn air in Connecticut had begun to turn sharp and cool, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and damp earth. Alicia walked down the long gravel path that curved toward the smaller gate used by the household staff. The grand mansion behind her glowed with warm golden light through tall windows, but beyond the gate the street returned to something quieter and more ordinary. Her apartment sat about 20 minutes away by bus in a modest neighborhood near the edge of Stamford. It was not large, just a small second-floor unit above a family-owned grocery store, but it was clean and filled with the gentle sounds of life. When Alicia pushed open the door that evening, the faint aroma of tomato soup greeted her from the kitchen. Her mother, Lorraine Carter, stood at the stove stirring slowly while an old radio played soft jazz from the counter. "You are home early tonight," Lorraine said without turning around. Alicia placed her bag on the small table near the door and removed her coat. "Work finished sooner than expected," she replied. Lorraine glanced over her shoulder and smiled warmly. Her hair had turned silver over the years, but her eyes still carried the quiet strength that Alicia had known since childhood. "Sit down. Dinner is almost ready." Alicia walked to the kitchen table and placed the cream-colored envelope gently beside her. Lorraine noticed it immediately. "What is that?" she asked. Alicia slid the invitation across the table. Lorraine wiped her hands on a kitchen towel and opened the envelope carefully. As she read the elegant lettering, her eyebrows lifted in surprise. The Whitmore Charity Gala. She looked up slowly. They invited you. Alicia leaned back in her chair. Yes. Lorraine studied the card again before letting out a small, thoughtful breath. That is quite an event. People talk about that gala on the news every year. Alicia nodded slightly. I know. Lorraine set the invitation down and looked directly at her daughter. Why do I feel like this was not meant as kindness? Alicia gave a faint smile that carried both patience and understanding. Because it was not. Lorraine shook her head gently. Some people think dignity is measured by the room you walk into. Alicia rested her hands on the table and looked at the invitation again. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The small kitchen felt peaceful with the radio playing softly and the quiet clatter of the spoon against the soup pot. Finally, Lorraine spoke again. Are you going? Alicia looked out the window toward the street where a single streetlight cast a pale circle on the sidewalk below. A city bus rolled past slowly, its engine rumbling through the evening air. Yes, she said calmly. Lorraine did not look surprised. I thought you might. Alicia's voice remained steady. They expect a joke. Lorraine leaned forward slightly. And what will they get? Alicia folded the invitation and slid it back into the envelope. Her expression was peaceful, but her eyes held a quiet determination that seemed older than her years. They will get exactly what they invited, she said softly. Lorraine studied her daughter for a moment longer before smiling with quiet pride. Well then, she said as she turned back toward the stove, you should probably start thinking about what you are going to wear. Alicia leaned back in her chair and listened to the soft jazz drifting from the radio while the evening settled around their small apartment. Somewhere across town, the Whitmore estate continued preparing for the most glamorous event of the season. Crystal glasses were polished. Silk tablecloths were unfolded. Invitations were confirmed. None of the guests who would soon walk through those towering doors had any idea that one quiet maid from the staff entrance had already decided to attend, and that her arrival would change the entire meaning of the night. The following afternoon, the Whitmore estate felt different. The decorators had finished transforming the ballroom, and the once quiet halls now carried the faint scent of fresh orchids and polished silver. Alicia Carter moved through the main staircase corridor with a feather duster in her hand, carefully cleaning the carved railing that curved toward the grand foyer. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, catching the floating dust in soft golden beams. From downstairs, she could hear the voices of the event planners discussing final details. One voice stood out above the rest. Emily Whitmore. Alicia did not need to see her to recognize the confident rhythm of her speech. Emily was giving instructions near the entrance hall where workers were arranging long tables for the reception. The marble floors below reflected the enormous crystal chandelier that hung above the center of the foyer like a frozen waterfall of light. Alicia continued dusting quietly until the voices drifted closer up the staircase. Emily and two of her friends were walking slowly through the hall, their heels clicking against the polished floor. Alicia lowered her eyes politely and stepped aside as they passed. Emily stopped when she noticed her. Alicia, she said, her tone bright with curiosity. I was just telling my friends about our very special invitation this year. Alicia waited calmly. Emily crossed her arms lightly and leaned against the railing. You remember the gala is tomorrow night, correct? Alicia nodded once. Yes, Miss Whitmore. One of Emily's friends smiled with playful interest. So you are actually thinking about coming? Alicia answered with the same steady calm she always carried. I have received the invitation. Emily gave a small laugh. That was not exactly my question. Alicia met her gaze without hesitation. Then yes, she said simply. Emily blinked once, clearly surprised by the certainty in Alicia's voice. For a brief moment, the hallway grew quiet except for the distant hum of workers downstairs. Emily's friend exchanged amused glances. Well, this I have to see, the friend said softly. Emily tilted her head as though studying Alicia for the first time. You know the dress code is formal, she said slowly. Most guests will be arriving in designer gowns and tailored tuxedos. Alicia's expression did not change. I understand. Emily stepped a little closer, her voice lowering slightly. I would hate for you to feel uncomfortable in a room like that. Alicia rested the feather duster gently against the railing and straightened her posture. Thank you for your concern, Miss Whitmore, she replied calmly. Emily looked at her for another moment, perhaps expecting hesitation or embarrassment, but Alicia's face remained peaceful. Finally, Emily gave a quick smile that did not quite reach her eyes. Well then I suppose we will see you tomorrow evening. Alicia nodded politely. Yes, Miss Whitmore. Emily turned and continued walking down the corridor with her friends, their quiet laughter fading as they descended the staircase. Alicia remained standing beside the railing for a moment after they disappeared. Through the tall window beside her, she could see the long driveway stretching across the estate grounds where gardeners were trimming hedges in preparation for the arriving guests. Expensive cars would soon line that path. Politicians, investors, and celebrities would step out beneath the glowing lights of the Whitmore mansion, expecting another flawless evening of wealth and influence. Alicia picked up the feather duster again and finished cleaning the railing with careful precision. Her reflection appeared faintly in the polished wood, calm and steady. Downstairs, Emily Whitmore's voice echoed once more as she continued organizing the event. Neither she nor any of the guests who would soon fill the ballroom realized that the quiet maid who had just confirmed her attendance was already preparing for something far greater than the joke they had imagined. The morning of the gala arrived with a cold silver light stretching across Connecticut. Frost clung to the grass along the Whitmore estate, turning the vast lawns pale under the rising sun. Inside the mansion, the staff had been working since early morning. Long banquet tables had been dressed in white silk cloth. Hundreds of crystal glasses caught the light like scattered diamonds. The scent of fresh orchids drifted through the ballroom, where towering floral arrangements stood beside polished marble columns. Alicia Carter walked through the service hallway carrying a tray of folded linen napkins. Her footsteps were quiet against the tiled floor, steady and unhurried as always. For the staff, the gala meant longer hours and careful preparation. Every detail had to be perfect before the first guest arrived. Alicia placed the napkins on the kitchen counter where the catering team was already working. Chefs moved quickly between stainless steel tables while the head coordinator checked the final list of deliveries. Outside the kitchen door, a row of black luxury vehicles had begun arriving to drop off early equipment and security personnel. The Whitmore Charity Gala was not simply a party. It was the most visible social event of the year for the city elite. Alicia stepped back into the hallway and glanced through the tall window overlooking the front drive. Workers were placing velvet ropes along the entrance where photographers would soon gather. The driveway stretched nearly half a mile from the iron gate to the front steps, lined with trimmed hedges and lantern lights that would glow after sunset. Alicia studied the view for a quiet moment before returning to her duties. Later that afternoon, her shift finally ended. Most of the staff would remain through the evening to serve the guests, but Alicia had requested to leave before the event began. Her supervisor had approved it with little thought. After all, in their minds, she was simply another house employee finishing her schedule early. Alicia walked down the familiar gravel path toward the staff gate, her coat wrapped tightly against the winter air. The sky had turned a deep pale blue, and the sun hung low behind the tall oak trees that surrounded the estate. By the time she reached her apartment, the streetlights were beginning to glow along the quiet block. Inside the small kitchen, her mother Lorraine was sitting by the window with a warm cup of tea. "You were home earlier than usual," Lorraine said gently. Alicia hung her coat near the door. "Tonight is the gala," she replied. Lorraine nodded slowly. "I remember." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Alicia walked into the bedroom and opened the small closet beside the bed. Inside hung only a few simple outfits and one garment carefully protected inside a fabric cover. Alicia lifted the cover down and placed it on the bed. Lorraine appeared quietly in the doorway. "So that is the dress," she said softly. Alicia unzipped the cover and revealed a long black evening gown that shimmered faintly in the lamplight. The fabric was elegant but understated, the kind of design that did not demand attention, yet carried unmistakable grace. Lorraine stepped closer and touched the sleeve with gentle admiration. "You kept it all these years," Alicia nodded. "Some things deserve patience," she said quietly. Lorraine looked at her daughter with calm understanding. "Do you feel ready?" Alicia answered without hesitation. "Yes." Lorraine smiled softly. "Then tonight they will see who you truly are." Alicia lifted the gown carefully and held it against the light from the window. Outside, a distant car passed along the quiet street, its headlights sliding briefly across the glass. In just a few hours, the Whitmore estate would glow with music and laughter as the wealthiest guests in the city stepped onto the marble floors expecting another flawless evening. None of them imagined that among the arriving guests would be the same woman they had laughed about only days earlier. And none of them understood that when Alicia Carter walked through those doors, she would not enter as the joke they had invited, but as something far more powerful than they were prepared to face. By early evening, the Whitmore estate looked less like a private home and more like a palace of light. Lanterns lined the half-mile driveway, casting warm golden circles across the gravel path that curved through the vast property. Tall white tents had been placed across the gardens, where soft music drifted through hidden speakers, blending with the gentle sound of the marble fountain near the front steps. Inside the ballroom, hundreds of candles reflected across crystal chandeliers, filling the enormous space with a quiet shimmering glow. One by one, the first guests began to arrive. Long black cars rolled slowly through the iron gates, stopping beneath the wide stone entrance where attendants opened doors and welcomed guests with polished smiles. Women stepped out wearing flowing gowns of silk and velvet, while men adjusted tailored tuxedos beneath the cool evening air. Cameras flashed along the edge of the driveway where a small group of photographers waited to capture the arrivals. Richard Whitmore stood near the entrance greeting guests personally, his posture confident and relaxed in a perfectly fitted black tuxedo. Beside him, Emily Whitmore moved easily through the crowd, offering practiced smiles and graceful greetings to the investors and politicians who filled the marble foyer. Everything appeared flawless, exactly the way Richard Whitmore expected it to be. The charity gala had always been a symbol of his influence, a night when the wealthiest names in the state gathered beneath his roof. Inside the ballroom, a string quartet played soft classical music, while servers carried trays of sparkling drinks through the slowly growing crowd. Laughter rose gently from small groups of conversation as the evening settled into its elegant rhythm. Emily leaned toward one of her friends near the grand staircase. "Do you remember the invitation we gave our maid?" she whispered with playful curiosity. Her friend laughed quietly. "I was just thinking about that. Imagine if she actually showed up." Emily glanced toward the entrance as another pair of guests stepped inside. "I almost hope she does," she said with a smile. The room could use a little entertainment. Meanwhile, several miles away, Alicia Carter stood in front of the small mirror in her apartment bedroom. The black gown rested smoothly against her shoulders, its simple elegance shaping the quiet confidence in her posture. The soft fabric shimmered faintly under the warm lamplight, catching the slightest movement as she adjusted the sleeve. Lorraine Carter stood behind her daughter with a gentle expression of pride. "You look exactly the way you were meant to look tonight," she said softly. Alicia studied her reflection calmly. Her dark curls framed her face with quiet grace, and her eyes carried the same steady composure she had shown every day inside the Whitmore mansion. She lifted a small silver clasp and fastened it around her wrist. Outside the apartment window, the city lights of Stamford glowed across the evening streets where cars moved slowly through the winter air. Lorraine stepped closer and placed a reassuring hand on her daughter's shoulder. "Are you ready?" Alicia nodded once. "Yes." Lorraine smiled. "Then go remind them that dignity does not depend on where someone works." Alicia picked up the cream-colored invitation from the table beside the door and slipped it carefully into her evening clutch. Moments later, she stepped outside onto the quiet sidewalk where the cool night air brushed gently against her face. A car waited at the curb with its engine humming softly beneath the streetlight. Alicia paused for a brief moment and looked down the peaceful neighborhood street before opening the door and stepping inside. The driver pulled away from the curb, and the city lights slowly faded behind them as the car moved toward the long road that would lead to the Whitmore estate. Across the countryside, the grand mansion was already glowing like a beacon against the dark sky, while laughter and music drifted through the winter air. Inside that bright ballroom, the guests continued their conversations, unaware that the woman they had once invited as a joke was now quietly on her way, and that the moment she stepped through those doors, the entire room would soon fall into a silence none of them expected. The car carrying Alicia Carter turned slowly through the tall iron gates of the Whitmore estate just after 8 in the evening. Lantern lights stretched along the long driveway like a glowing path, guiding every arriving guest toward the grand mansion that stood illuminated against the dark winter sky. The driver followed the curve of the gravel road where a line of luxury cars moved steadily toward the front entrance. Alicia sat quietly in the back seat, her hands resting calmly in her lap as the estate grounds unfolded before her. Beyond the window, she could see the enormous white columns of the mansion glowing beneath golden lights, while soft music drifted through the open doors of the ballroom. Servers moved between arriving guests carrying trays of champagne, while photographers stood behind velvet ropes capturing each arrival. The car finally slowed to a stop near the wide stone steps that led up to the front entrance. An attendant stepped forward and opened the door with a polite nod. For a brief moment Alicia remained seated, looking up at the mansion where she had spent so many ordinary days working quietly in the background. Tonight the same building looked completely different. The marble staircase shone beneath towering chandeliers, and elegant laughter echoed through the open doorway where the most powerful guests in the state were already gathering. Alicia stepped out of the car with calm grace, the long black gown moving softly with each step as she straightened her posture beneath the cool evening air. The fabric shimmered gently beneath the lantern lights, simple yet striking in its quiet elegance. The attendant glanced at her with polite curiosity before offering a respectful gesture toward the entrance. "Welcome to the Whitmore Charity Gala," he said. Alicia nodded once and walked slowly toward the steps. Inside the marble foyer the atmosphere was alive with conversation. Richard Whitmore stood near the entrance greeting a pair of investors while Emily Whitmore moved through the crowd beside him, smiling confidently as she introduced guests to one another. Laughter rose through the ballroom, where the string quartet continued playing softly near the center of the room. For several minutes, the evening unfolded exactly as expected. Guests exchanged stories, glasses clinked gently, and the glow of chandeliers reflected across polished floors. Then the front doors opened again. Alicia Carter stepped into the foyer. For a brief second no one noticed. Conversations continued while servers moved through the room, carrying trays of drinks. But as Alicia began walking forward across the marble floor, something subtle shifted in the atmosphere. One of the event coordinators paused mid-sentence while watching her pass. A guest near the staircase lowered his glass slightly as he studied her with quiet confusion. The elegant black gown flowed smoothly as Alicia crossed the entrance hall with calm confidence. Her posture was steady, her expression peaceful, and the quiet dignity in her presence carried a weight that felt impossible to ignore. Emily Whitmore happened to glance toward the entrance just as Alicia reached the center of the foyer. At first, Emily simply blinked as if trying to recognize someone she had not expected to see. The conversation around her faded for a moment as her eyes focused fully on the woman standing beneath the chandelier light. "That is not possible," she whispered softly. One of her friends turned toward the entrance as well. "Wait," is that the words stopped halfway through her sentence as the realization spread across her face. Alicia Carter stood calmly among the arriving guests, no longer wearing the uniform of a maid, but the quiet elegance of someone who belonged exactly where she was standing. Across the room, Richard Whitmore followed the direction of the growing silence and slowly turned toward the foyer. The moment his eyes found Alicia, the faint smile on his face disappeared. Conversations began to fade as more guests noticed the shift in the room. One by one heads turned toward the entrance where the woman they had expected to laugh at had just arrived with a presence that commanded the entire room. And in the growing silence beneath the chandelier light, Alicia Carter took another calm step forward into the Whitmore Charity Gala. The silence that followed Alicia Carter's entrance spread slowly through the ballroom like a ripple across still water. Conversations faded one voice at a time as more guests turned to see what had drawn the sudden attention near the entrance. Beneath the towering crystal chandelier, Alicia walked forward with calm, steady steps, the soft fabric of her black gown gliding across the polished marble floor. The warm golden light reflected gently across her shoulders, and the quiet dignity in her posture carried a presence far stronger than the laughter that had once surrounded her name. Emily Whitmore stood frozen near the grand staircase, her glass still lifted halfway to her lips. For a moment, she looked as though she could not quite understand what she was seeing. The woman standing in the center of the foyer looked nothing like the maid who quietly polished the floors of the mansion every morning. Alicia Carter looked composed, elegant, and entirely unbothered by the dozens of eyes now fixed upon her. One of Emily's friends leaned closer and whispered softly, "That really is her." Emily lowered her glass slowly. The playful amusement that had colored her voice earlier in the evening had completely disappeared. Across the room, Richard Whitmore watched the scene unfold with a tightening expression. He had built his reputation on control. Every event he hosted, every business deal he negotiated, every moment inside his estate followed a structure he carefully maintained. But the woman walking calmly through the center of his ballroom was something he had not planned. Alicia paused briefly near the entrance to the ballroom, where the music from the string quartet drifted through the air. The musicians had slowed their playing slightly as the growing silence reached them. A few guests shifted awkwardly, unsure whether to continue their conversations or remain quiet. Alicia lifted her gaze calmly and surveyed the room. The same marble columns she had dusted countless mornings now framed the grand event in which she stood as a guest rather than a servant. She continued walking forward, her steps measured and unhurried. The crowd parted subtly as she moved deeper into the ballroom. Some guests looked confused. Others looked curious. A few whispered quietly to one another, trying to understand why the room had suddenly changed. Near the center of the ballroom, a tall man in a gray suit stared at Alicia with growing recognition. Daniel Brooks was a venture investor known throughout the state for his sharp memory and careful observation. His brow furrowed slightly as he studied her face. "That cannot be," he murmured under his breath. One of the executives beside him leaned closer. "What is it?" Daniel did not answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on Alicia as she approached the edge of the main reception floor. The quiet confidence in her expression stirred something familiar in his memory. Across the room, Emily finally found her voice again. "Alicia," she called gently, forcing a polite smile as several guests turned toward her. Alicia stopped and turned toward Emily with calm grace. "Good evening, Miss Whitmore," she said softly. The simple greeting seemed to echo through the ballroom. Emily stepped forward slowly, her heels clicking across the marble as she approached. "I did not expect you to arrive so soon," she said carefully. Alicia held the small evening clutch in her hand and nodded politely. "Your invitation was very clear." Several nearby guests listened closely now, sensing that the moment carried more tension than ordinary conversation. Emily forced another smile. "Well, I hope you are enjoying the evening so far." Alicia's expression remained serene. "I have only just arrived." Meanwhile, Daniel Brooks continued watching from across the room, his mind turning rapidly through years of meetings and conferences. Then suddenly something in his memory aligned. His eyes widened slightly as the realization settled in. He stepped forward through the crowd, his voice low but filled with unmistakable surprise. "Alicia Carter," he said slowly. The name carried across the nearby guests like a sudden spark of electricity. Alicia turned toward him calmly. "Good evening, Mr. Brooks." Daniel Brooks stared at her for a moment longer before letting out a quiet breath of disbelief. "My goodness," he said softly. "I wondered if it could really be you." The surrounding guests exchanged puzzled looks as the tension in the room shifted again. Because the way Daniel Brooks had just spoken her name did not sound like someone recognizing a maid. It sounded like someone recognizing a person of far greater importance than anyone in the Whitmore ballroom had imagined. A quiet murmur spread through the ballroom after Daniel Brooks spoke Alicia Carter's name. The tone in his voice carried something unmistakable, not surprise alone, but recognition mixed with respect. Guests who had been whispering moments earlier now watched the two of them closely. Daniel stepped forward through the small circle of onlookers until he stood only a few feet from Alicia. For a moment, he simply studied her face as if confirming a memory he had not expected to see again. Alicia inclined her head slightly with calm politeness. "It has been a long time, Mr. Brooks," she said gently. Daniel let out a short breath that almost sounded like a quiet laugh of disbelief. "That is quite an understatement," he replied. "The last time I saw you was in San Francisco at the Technology Innovation Summit." Several nearby guests exchanged confused glances. "San Francisco," someone whispered softly. Emily Whitmore's eyes moved quickly between them, the careful smile on her face beginning to tighten. "I am sorry," Emily said, stepping forward cautiously. "Have you two met before?" Daniel turned his head slowly toward her. "Met before," he repeated with mild astonishment. Miss Whitmore, Alicia Carter, was the keynote analyst at the summit 3 years ago. She was the one who presented the predictive financial model that saved my firm nearly $500 million. The words seemed to hang in the air above the crowd like a suspended bell waiting to ring. A few guests blinked as if they had misheard him. $500 million, one investor murmured quietly to another. Emily looked at Alicia again, this time with a faint crease forming between her brows. I believe there must be some confusion, she said carefully. Alicia works here. Daniel's gaze returned to Alicia with genuine curiosity. Works here, he repeated slowly. Alicia folded her hands lightly in front of her evening clutch. Yes, Mr. Brooks, she answered calmly. For the past 2 years. A ripple of astonishment moved through the nearby guests. Daniel shook his head slowly as if trying to piece together a puzzle that refused to fit. That makes absolutely no sense, he said softly. Your work in financial modeling was being discussed across half the industry. Several major investment groups were trying to recruit you after that presentation. Alicia's expression remained peaceful. I am aware, she said. Then why? Daniel stopped himself mid-sentence as more guests gathered quietly around them. Richard Whitmore had stepped closer as well, his expression no longer confident, but sharply attentive. Daniel lowered his voice slightly, although the surrounding silence made every word easy to hear. Alicia, you designed the algorithm that helped my firm recover from the worst market collapse we had faced in 20 years. Without that model, we would have lost everything. Why in the world would you be working as a housemaid? Alicia lifted her gaze and met his eyes with quiet composure. Because sometimes understanding a system requires seeing how people behave when they believe no one important is watching, she replied softly. The meaning in her words settled slowly over the listeners. Emily Whitmore shifted uncomfortably where she stood. A few guests glanced toward Richard Whitmore, whose posture had grown noticeably rigid. Daniel Brooks studied Alicia's face again, this time with something closer to admiration. My goodness, he said under his breath. You really did it. You disappeared completely. Alicia gave the smallest nod. It allowed me to observe people more honestly. One of the guests near the back of the circle whispered quietly to his companion. Are we saying that the maid Richard Whitmore invited tonight is actually the Alicia Carter who designed the Brooks recovery model? The whisper passed quickly through the crowd like a spark through dry leaves. Several people turned toward Richard Whitmore now, waiting for his response. But Richard did not speak. For the first time since the gala had begun, the man who controlled the entire room looked as though he had just realized he no longer understood the situation unfolding in his own ballroom. And at the center of that growing silence, Alicia Carter stood calmly beneath the chandelier light, her quiet presence now carrying a weight far greater than anyone had imagined when the invitation had first been written. The silence in the Whitmore ballroom deepened after Alicia Carter's quiet answer. Conversations had completely stopped now. The soft music from the string quartet faded into an uncertain pause as the musicians sensed the tension spreading through the room. Crystal glasses remained half lifted in the hands of guests who no longer seemed interested in drinking. Every eye had turned toward the center of the ballroom, where Alicia stood calmly beside Daniel Brooks. Richard Whitmore finally stepped forward. His posture was still tall, but the confidence that had defined him earlier in the evening had begun to shift into something more cautious. Alicia Carter, he said slowly, speaking her name with deliberate control. I believe we have a misunderstanding. His voice carried the calm tone of a man used to restoring order when a situation drifted beyond his expectations. You are saying that you designed the financial recovery model Mr. Brooks just described. Alicia turned toward him with the same composed expression she had carried since entering the room. Yes, Mr. Whitmore, she replied. Richard clasped his hands lightly behind his back as he studied her. Several guests leaned closer, sensing that the conversation was about to reveal something important. Richard gave a polite smile that did not fully hide the tension in his jaw. Forgive me for asking directly, he said, but if you are truly the Alicia Carter who presented that model at the technology summit, then I must ask the same question Mr. Brooks already raised. Why would someone with your background spend 2 years working in my house as a cleaner? The question hung in the quiet air. Alicia paused briefly before answering. Because there are certain truths that can only be seen from the lowest place in a room, she said softly. Richard's brow tightened slightly. I do not follow. Alicia turned slowly, letting her gaze move across the faces of the guests gathered around them. Investors, executives, politicians. Every person in the room represented power in some form. When people believe someone has no influence, she continued calmly, they stop pretending to be kind. They stop filtering their words. They reveal who they truly are when they believe the person standing nearby does not matter. A quiet murmur moved through the surrounding guests as the meaning of her words began to settle in. Emily Whitmore shifted beside her father. "That sounds like a very unusual research project," she said carefully. Alicia met her gaze without hostility. "It has been very educational," she replied. Daniel Brooks nodded slowly, as if the explanation now made sense. "My goodness," he said softly. "You wanted to study human behavior in environments of wealth and power." Alicia gave a small nod. "Exactly." Richard Whitmore remained silent for a moment, absorbing the implications of what he had just heard. The quiet tension in the room had changed again. This was no longer simply the arrival of an unexpected guest. This was the realization that someone many of them had ignored or dismissed had been quietly observing them the entire time. Richard cleared his throat gently. "And what conclusions have you reached during your time in my house?" he asked. Alicia's expression remained peaceful as she answered. "That dignity is rarely connected to status, and respect is often shown only when people believe it might benefit them." Several guests looked away uncomfortably. The words carried a calm honesty that felt impossible to argue with. Daniel Brooks folded his arms thoughtfully. "You could publish a remarkable study from that experience," he said. Alicia smiled faintly. "Perhaps." Richard Whitmore looked around the ballroom, where dozens of powerful individuals were now waiting silently for his reaction. For the first time that evening, the man who owned the mansion appeared uncertain how to respond. Because the quiet maid he had once invited as a joke had just transformed the entire gala into something far more serious than entertainment. And the realization slowly settling over the room was simple, but impossible to ignore. Alicia Carter had not come to this ballroom seeking approval. She had come to reveal the truth about everyone standing inside it. The weight of Alicia Carter's words lingered in the ballroom long after she finished speaking. The silence that followed was different from the earlier shock when she first entered. That silence had been confusion. This silence was reflection. Guests shifted slightly where they stood, some lowering their eyes toward the polished marble floor, while others quietly studied the woman who had just challenged the unspoken rules of the entire room. Richard Whitmore remained standing across from her, the glow of the chandelier reflecting faintly in his eyes. For a moment, the powerful businessman who controlled one of the largest investment groups in the state looked less like a commanding host and more like a man confronting an unexpected mirror. Daniel Brooks broke the quiet first. He turned slowly toward the surrounding guests, his voice thoughtful. "I believe Miss Carter has given all of us something worth thinking about tonight," he said calmly. Several guests nodded subtly. Others remained silent but attentive. Emily Whitmore stood beside her father with her arms folded lightly across her evening gown. The confident ease she had shown earlier in the evening had faded into something more uncertain. She looked at Alicia again, but this time the expression in her eyes held curiosity rather than amusement. Alicia Carter stood calmly beneath the chandelier, her hands resting lightly around the small evening clutch she carried. She had not raised her voice. She had not accused anyone directly. Yet the quiet honesty of her words had changed the atmosphere of the entire gala. Richard Whitmore finally spoke again. His voice was lower now, measured in a way that suggested careful thought rather than casual authority. "Miss Carter," he said slowly, "I will admit that when my daughter and I sent that invitation, we expected something entirely different tonight." A few guests exchanged uneasy glances. Emily lowered her gaze slightly, but did not interrupt. Richard continued. "I thought I understood the people who worked in my house. I believed I treated them fairly." Alicia listened quietly without interrupting. Richard looked around the ballroom at the guests who had gathered to witness the moment. "But listening to you speak this evening has forced me to consider something uncomfortable," he said. "That perhaps respect is not measured only by fairness, but by the assumptions we carry without realizing it." The honesty in his voice surprised several listeners. Daniel Brooks gave a small approving nod. "That realization alone puts you ahead of many leaders I have met, Richard," he said. Richard turned back toward Alicia. "I would like to apologize," he said plainly. "Not because you exposed us in some public way, but because I see now that we invited you here expecting to laugh at you rather than welcome you." The words carried clearly through the silent ballroom. Emily Whitmore took a small step forward beside her father. "Alicia," she said quietly, "I owe you an apology as well. When we first talked about the invitation, I believed the situation would be amusing. But I can see now that we underestimated you in ways that say more about us than about you." Alicia watched them both with calm eyes. For several seconds, she did not respond. Then she gave a small, respectful nod. "I appreciate your honesty," she said gently. Richard seemed relieved by the simple acknowledgement. Daniel Brooks looked toward Alicia with thoughtful interest. "If I may ask one more question," he said. "After everything you have learned during these past 2 years, what will you do next?" Alicia considered the question briefly before answering. "I will continue studying the relationship between power and human behavior," she said. "But I believe I will do it from a different place now." Daniel smiled faintly. "I imagine many institutions would be eager to support that work." A quiet murmur of agreement moved through the surrounding guests. Several investors were already exchanging thoughtful looks, as if reconsidering their earlier assumptions about the woman standing before them. Alicia glanced around the ballroom one final time. The same guests who had once ignored her presence were now listening carefully to every word she spoke. The contrast was impossible to miss. And in that moment it became clear to everyone present that the evening had changed something deeper than a simple misunderstanding. Alicia Carter had walked into the Whitmore Charity Gala as the maid they expected to laugh at, but she now stood at the center of the room as the one person who had quietly reminded them what dignity actually looked like. The atmosphere inside the Whitmore ballroom had shifted in a way none of the guests could ignore. What began as an evening of polite laughter and carefully practiced conversations had slowly transformed into something deeper. The music from the string quartet resumed gently in the background, but it no longer dominated the room. Instead, quiet discussions moved through the crowd as people reconsidered the woman standing calmly beneath the chandelier light. Alicia Carter remained composed, her posture relaxed yet confident as she listened to the surrounding guests. Daniel Brooks stepped slightly closer, his voice thoughtful but warm. "Miss Carter, I believe many of the people in this room are realizing that tonight has become far more meaningful than any charity speech we had planned." A few nearby investors nodded in agreement. One older woman who chaired several nonprofit boards spoke softly to the person beside her. "I have attended this gala for years, and I have never seen the room listen this carefully." Richard Whitmore took a slow breath as he looked across the ballroom. The event he had carefully planned now carried a different kind of attention, but rather than resisting it, he seemed to accept the change. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said clearly, his voice rising just enough to reach the surrounding crowd. "I believe we have all witnessed something important tonight." Conversation stopped again as guests turned toward him. Richard gestured lightly toward Alicia. The Whitmore Charity Gala was created to support research into social development and public understanding. But tonight Miss Carter has demonstrated that sometimes the most valuable lessons arrive without formal speeches or prepared presentations. A ripple of thoughtful agreement moved through the room. Emily Whitmore stood beside her father, her earlier confidence replaced with a quieter expression. She turned toward Alicia with sincerity that had not been present before. "Alicia, if you would allow it, I would like to ask something." Alicia nodded gently. "Of course." Emily hesitated briefly before speaking. "When you worked in our house, did you already know that you might eventually reveal this research publicly?" Alicia considered the question calmly. "No," she replied. "I did not begin with the intention of revealing anything at an event like this." Emily looked genuinely curious. "Then why come tonight?" Alicia glanced around the ballroom once more, taking in the elegant surroundings that had once seemed so distant from her daily work. "Because sometimes the moment presents itself when people least expect it," she said softly. "And when that moment arrives, it becomes an opportunity to remind others of something simple." Emily tilted her head slightly. "What is that?" Alicia answered without hesitation. "That dignity does not change based on the role someone is assigned." Several guests nodded quietly. Daniel Brooks smiled with clear admiration. "I believe that message will remain with many people in this room long after tonight," he said. One of the younger entrepreneurs stepped forward from the crowd. "Miss Carter, if you continue your research, I would be honored to support it." Another voice joined from the opposite side of the ballroom. "Our foundation would also be interested in funding work like that." Within moments, several guests began expressing similar interest, their earlier assumptions replaced by genuine respect. Alicia listened politely, but raised one hand gently. "I appreciate the support," she said calmly. "But the most important outcome tonight is not funding. It is reflection. If people leave this room thinking more carefully about how they treat those around them, then the experience has already succeeded." The sincerity in her voice quieted the room again. Richard Whitmore nodded slowly. Miss Carter, I believe you have given this event a meaning it has never had before. Alicia offered a small respectful smile. Then perhaps the invitation served its purpose after all, she replied. Soft laughter moved through the crowd, not mocking but appreciative. And in that moment it became clear that the Whitmore Charity Gala would be remembered for something far more significant than luxury or reputation. It would be remembered as the evening when a woman once dismissed as a maid stood calmly before the most powerful guests in the room and reminded them what genuine respect truly meant. The Whitmore ballroom slowly returned to life after Alicia Carter finished speaking. Conversations resumed, but they were different now. The laughter that filled the room earlier had softened into thoughtful discussion, and many of the guests found themselves glancing toward Alicia with quiet respect rather than curiosity. The chandeliers above continued to glow warmly, reflecting across polished marble floors where the evening had taken an unexpected turn. Richard Whitmore stood near the center of the room for a moment longer before stepping closer to Alicia. His voice carried a sincerity that had not been present when the night began. Miss Carter, he said, tonight you have reminded me of something I should have understood long ago. Influence does not come from wealth alone. Alicia listened calmly as he continued. When we invited you here, we expected a moment of amusement. Instead, you gave this entire room a moment of truth. Alicia offered a small respectful nod. Sometimes the truth simply needs an opportunity to be seen, she replied gently. Richard nodded slowly. And tonight you gave it that opportunity. Emily Whitmore stepped forward as well, her expression thoughtful. Alicia, I would like to thank you for coming tonight, even after the way the invitation was given. I imagine many people would have ignored it entirely. Alicia looked at her with quiet kindness. If I had ignored it, none of us would have had this conversation, she said. Emily smiled faintly at the honesty in her response. Daniel Brooks approached once more, his voice calm but confident. Alicia, I meant what I said earlier. Your work deserves support. If you choose to continue your research, my firm would gladly help you present it to universities and policy groups across the country. Several nearby guests nodded with agreement. A few had already begun discussing how Alicia observations could influence future leadership training or social research programs. Alicia considered their words for a moment before answering. I appreciate the offer, Mr. Brooks, she said. But my goal has never been recognition. My goal has always been understanding. Daniel smiled warmly. The best researchers often say the same thing. Richard Whitmore glanced around the ballroom before raising his glass slightly. Ladies and gentlemen, he said clearly. Tonight our charity gala has supported many causes over the years, but I believe we have just witnessed the most powerful message this event has ever carried. Guests raised their glasses quietly in agreement. Respect is not defined by a title, he continued. It is defined by how we treat people when we believe they have nothing to offer us. The words settled through the room with quiet weight. Alicia gave a polite nod before stepping back toward the entrance of the ballroom. Daniel noticed her movement. Are you leaving already? He asked. Alicia smiled gently. I believe the lesson has already been shared, she said. There is no need for me to remain longer than necessary. Emily walked with her toward the marble foyer. Alicia paused briefly beneath the chandelier where the evening had first changed. Thank you for coming, she said sincerely. Alicia looked around the grand entrance one final time. The same mansion where she had once worked quietly now held a different memory for everyone inside it. Thank you for the invitation, Alicia replied softly. Outside, the cool Connecticut night waited beyond the open doors. Alicia stepped down the wide stone staircase where the lantern lights still lined the long driveway. A car pulled forward to meet her, its headlights cutting gently through the darkness. As the vehicle carried her away from the estate, the glowing mansion slowly faded behind the trees. Inside the ballroom, the guests continued speaking quietly about the moment they had just witnessed. They had invited a maid to their celebration expecting a joke. Instead, they had watched her walk into the room with calm dignity and remind them of something many powerful people forget. Respect is not given by status. It is revealed by character. And that night, Alicia Carter had left the Whitmore Charity Gala exactly the way she arrived. Calm, unshaken, and carrying the quiet strength of someone who never needed permission to stand like a queen.